I never believed in curses. Stories passed down from generation to generation were simply cautionary tales, meant to keep us grounded. At least, that's what I told myself. Until it started happening to me. It all began with an old, tattered journal I found hidden away in my grandfather's attic. I'd always known he was an archaeologist, but his work had never been a topic of discussion. He died when I was young, and my family rarely mentioned his expeditions. The journal seemed to be his, its pages yellowed and brittle, filled with notes scribbled in a language I could barely understand. One entry caught my attention. June 21st, 1941, Tamerlane's tomb opened. A shiver ran down my spine. I knew of Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, the conqueror whose empire stretched from Persia to India. There had always been rumors surrounding his final resting place, ancient legends that warned of unimaginable consequences for anyone who dared disturb it. But legends were just that, weren't they? The night I brought the journal home, everything changed. I was lying in bed, the journal resting on my nightstand, when I felt something off. A heavy silence settled over the room, thicker than the darkness itself. My chest tightened as I struggled to breathe, and the faintest whisper echoed through the air. It was a language I didn't understand, ancient and guttural, like something not meant for human ears. The temperature plummeted, frost creeping along the edges of my window, and my breath turned to mist. I sat up, heart racing. My eyes darted around the room, but nothing was out of place. That's when I saw it. Standing at the foot of my bed was a shadow, tall, with broad shoulders and an imposing figure. It was not human, not entirely. Its eyes, no, not eyes, empty pits stared at me, blacker than the night itself, and they seemed to draw me in as if the void beyond them was endless. I blinked and it was gone. I sat frozen in place, my body refusing to move. Had I imagined it? No, the frost was real. My breath still misted the air, and the feeling of being watched hadn't left. That was the first night. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. At work, on the streets, even in the safety of my own home, the sensation clung to me like a second skin. But no matter how many times I turned around, no one was ever there. Then came the dreams. Every night I found myself in a vast desert, a battlefield drenched in blood and fire. I wandered through the carnage, stepping over twisted bodies, their eyes hollow and accusing. At the center of it all stood a massive tomb, blackened stone towering into the sky with an inscription I couldn't read but somehow understood. He who disturbs this place will suffer eternal torment. One night the dream changed. As I approached the tomb, I saw a figure standing before it. This time it was real, more real than any nightmare. The figure was bent, its face obscured by shadows, but as I moved closer, it turned toward me. Its face, it was my grandfather. His eyes were wide, terrified, his mouth hanging open in a silent scream, and blood dripped from his hands, pooling at his feet. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. And then I woke up, only I didn't. I was still in my bed, still in the dream. And standing beside me, just inches from my face, was the same shadowy figure. Its breath was hot against my skin, smelling of decay and earth, and its voice, if you could call it that, rattled through the air like the scraping of bones. The curse cannot be undone. I shot up in bed, drenched in sweat, heart hammering in my chest. My room was silent again, but the frost on my window was thicker this time, the air colder. I reached for the journal, desperate to find some explanation, something that would make sense of the terror I was feeling. But when I opened it, the pages were blank. Every last one. My grandfather's notes, his sketches, his writings, all of it gone. I flipped through the pages frantically, but it was no use. The journal was empty, save for one word scrawled across the final page in thick red ink. Run. That's when the pounding started. At first it was distant, almost like a heartbeat, but it grew louder, relentless, like someone or something was slamming against the walls of the house. I leapt out of bed and stumbled toward the door, but the moment my hand touched the knob, it stopped. Silence enveloped the house once more, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it. A single, rasping breath right behind me. I spun around, my back pressed against the door, but the room was empty. The shadow was gone, the frost receding, and the air warmed again. But I wasn't alone. I knew that now. Whatever my grandfather had done, whatever he had unleashed, it wasn't finished. And now it had found me. I didn't sleep after that night. How could I? Every sound, every shift in the shadows felt like an imminent threat. The journal, which had once seemed like an innocuous relic of my grandfather's past, now felt like a ticking bomb, something alive, waiting for the right moment to go off again. I spent hours researching Tamerlane's tomb. The legends, the warnings, even the old wives' tales surrounding it painted a grim picture. They all said the same thing, leave it alone, but it was too late for that. My grandfather had opened the tomb, disturbed whatever ancient force had been locked away, and now his bloodline was paying the price. I hadn't mentioned what was happening to anyone, not yet. How could I? I think I'm being haunted by the curse of a centuries-old conqueror wasn't exactly something you could casually slip into conversation, but I couldn't face it alone anymore. The weight of it, the terror, was becoming too much to bear. I needed answers, so I reached out to someone who might understand. There was an old historian in town, someone who specialized in ancient civilizations. He was reclusive, a bit of a local eccentric, but if anyone knew the truth behind Tamerlane's curse, it would be him. His house was nestled on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in as I approached. The air grew thick, oppressive, like the very atmosphere knew what I was there to ask. I knocked on the door, heart thudding in my chest. For a long moment, nothing happened. The house loomed over me, silent and foreboding. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open, revealing the hunched figure of the historian. His eyes were sharp, suspicious, but he said nothing, just stepped aside, gesturing for me to enter. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of books and artifacts, relics of long-dead empires collecting dust on every surface. It smelled of decay, like old paper and something far more unsettling. He led me to a small study where a single dim lamp flickered on the desk. "You've come about the curse," he said, his voice rasping like dry leaves. It wasn't a question. I nodded, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. "How did you—" "Your grandfather," he interrupted. "He came to me once years ago, looking for the same answers. I told him to stop, to leave it alone." His eyes flickered to the journal in my hands. "But it's too late for that, isn't it?" I swallowed hard, setting the journal down on the desk. "It started with nightmares. And then, there's something following me. Something that isn't human." The historian's face darkened, and he leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Tamerlane wasn't just a conqueror. He was feared for more than his military might. There are stories, whispers of dark rituals performed before his battles, offerings made to ancient gods, blood spilled to secure his empire. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Offerings?" He nodded slowly. "When they opened his tomb in 1941, they found more than just his remains. There were signs, symbols carved into the stone, ancient markings that shouldn't have been there. Some say they were protective seals, meant to keep whatever power he wielded in life locked away. Your grandfather broke those seals." I sat there, silent, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a vice. "And now?" "Now, the curse has been set free," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The tomb's guardian, Tamerlane's protector in the afterlife, was never meant to be disturbed. It's come for you, and it won't stop until—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't have to. I could see it in his eyes. I leaned forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "How do I stop it?" The historian hesitated, then shook his head. "You can't. Once the curse is unleashed, it must run its course. Tamerlane's guardian won't rest until the bloodline is eradicated." My heart sank. I had feared as much, but hearing it spoken aloud sent a wave of dread crashing over me. "There must be something." He stared at me, his gaze piercing, as if weighing his next words carefully. "There is one way," he said slowly, "but it comes at a price." I didn't care. At that moment, I would have given anything to stop the nightmare from swallowing me whole. "What is it?" "The guardian can be tricked," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you must offer it something in return, something it values more than the bloodline. A sacrifice." A lump formed in my throat. "What kind of sacrifice?" The historian didn't answer. Instead, he opened a drawer and pulled out an ancient-looking dagger, its blade stained with something dark, something that had long since dried. "You already know the answer." I recoiled, my skin crawling at the sight of the blade. "You're saying I have to—" "Yes," he cut in sharply. "It must be blood for blood." But it cannot be just any blood. It must be... His gaze fell to the journal, then back to me. A descendant. I felt the room spin around me, my mind reeling from the weight of his words. I had family, people I loved. How could I even consider... Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness. The lamp flickered and died, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the historian's breathing quicken, but I couldn't see him. And then from the shadows I heard it again. That voice. The same one from my room, cold and ancient, dripping with malice. The curse cannot be undone. A sharp, wet thud echoed through the room, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. I froze, my blood turning to ice. When the lights flickered back on, the historian was slumped over his desk, his throat slit from ear to ear, blood pooling beneath him. I stumbled back, my mind screaming, but before I could react, I felt it, the breath on my neck. The rasping voice, so close I could feel it vibrate through my bones. Run! And this time I did. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the wet pavement outside the historian's house. My mind was a blur of terror and disbelief, my heart hammering in my chest so hard it felt like it might burst. The blood on the floor, his cold, lifeless body, the image was seared into my brain. I could still smell the metallic tang of it in the air, and the voice, that voice, still echoed in my ears. How had it all come to this? How had I gone from curiosity about my grandfather's past to being hunted by something I couldn't even comprehend? I stumbled home, every shadow stretching longer than it should, every rustle of the wind making me jump. The streets were empty, silent except for the pounding of my footsteps. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it, the thing that had followed me since that first night, stalking me in the darkness, but nothing was there, at least not yet. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door shut, bolting every lock I could. My lungs burned, my mind racing. I needed to figure out what to do next. The historian had said there was no stopping it, that the only way to escape the curse was through sacrifice. But I wouldn't do that. I wasn't about to sacrifice someone I loved just to save myself. There had to be another way. I collapsed onto the couch, my hands shaking. The journal was still in my bag, the empty pages mocking me. What had once been filled with my grandfather's notes was now a useless blank book, save for the single ominous word, run. I grabbed the journal and threw it across the room in frustration. It hit the wall with a dull thud, and for a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, the faintest of sounds, like the scratch of nails against wood. My heart froze in my chest. I turned toward the noise, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, but I was paralyzed with fear. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something was scraping its way out of the very walls. It was coming from behind the bookshelf, a place where no living thing should have been able to fit. My breath hitched in my throat as I stood up, slowly inching toward the sound. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I had to know. With trembling hands, I reached for the edge of the bookshelf and pulled it away from the wall. And that's when I saw it. A small hole, barely big enough for a hand to slip through, had been carved into the plaster. Inside, something glinted in the dim light, something metallic. My pulse quickened as I reached into the hole, fingers brushing against cold steel. I pulled out an object wrapped in old, brittle cloth. As I unwrapped it, the fabric disintegrated in my hands, revealing an ancient-looking amulet. The surface was covered in strange, indecipherable symbols, ones I recognized from the few pages I'd managed to read in my grandfather's journal before it had gone blank. Suddenly, the air in the room shifted. It was subtle at first, a pressure building, like the calm before a storm. But then the temperature dropped sharply, and the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I backed away, the amulet clutched tightly in my hand. The air grew heavier, thick with the smell of rot, and that same whispering voice, low and guttural, filled the room once again. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat as I saw it. The shadow, no longer confined to the edges of my vision. It stood in the middle of the room, larger now, more defined. Its form shifted, tendrils of darkness curling around it like smoke, and those hollow, empty pits where its eyes should have been fixed on me. It moved toward me, slowly at first, but with purpose. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. I stumbled back, my mind racing for any possible escape. And then I remembered the amulet. I didn't know what it was, or if it would even help, but it was my only option. I held it up, desperate, and the moment the metal touched my skin, the shadow froze. For a brief, terrifying second, everything was silent. The shadow stopped moving, and the air grew still, as if the entire world had taken a breath. And then it screamed. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard. Piercing, inhuman, filled with rage and agony. The shadow writhed, its form distorting violently as it recoiled from the amulet. I dropped it in shock, the metal clattering to the floor, and the shadow dissolved into a black mist, retreating into the corners of the room. I collapsed to the ground, my body shaking uncontrollably. The silence returned, but it was a fragile piece, one that felt temporary. I glanced at the amulet now lying harmlessly on the floor. It had worked, at least for now, but whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone. Not for good. I picked up the amulet, hands still trembling, and shoved it into my pocket. I didn't know what it was or why it had an effect on the shadow, but I knew I couldn't let it go. It might be my only defense against the thing that had been hunting me. But the relief didn't last long. As I stood up, my phone buzzed on the counter. I grabbed it, my heart skipping a beat when I saw the message. It was from my sister. "Can we talk? Something's been happening. Nightmares. And I've been seeing things. I think it's connected to Grandpa." My blood ran cold. The curse wasn't just after me, it was coming for all of us. I stared at my phone, my sister's message burning into my mind. The curse wasn't stopping with me, it was spreading. I had to do something now before it was too late. Grabbing the amulet, I bolted out the door, my mind racing as I called her. She picked up on the second ring, her voice shaking with fear. "I've been seeing things," she whispered. "Shadows, whispers, and the nightmares. It feels like someone's watching me. I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared." I tried to calm her, but the panic in her voice was unmistakable. "Listen to me," I said, gripping the steering wheel as I sped through the darkened streets. "I'm coming to you. Just stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone, okay? I'll explain everything when I get there." She agreed, but I could tell she was on edge. The fear in her voice mirrored my own, and I couldn't help but feel the weight of the curse pressing down on us both. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about my family, and I had to stop it no matter what. As I drove, flashes of the historian's words kept repeating in my head. A sacrifice. The bloodline had been marked, and it wouldn't stop until it claimed all of us. But there had to be another way. There had to be. When I arrived at my sister's house, I could feel the tension in the air before I even stepped inside. The windows were dark, the only light coming from a single lamp flickering inside. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. After a long, agonizing moment, she opened it, her face pale and drawn. "I don't know what's happening," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I feel like I'm being watched. All the time." I stepped inside, the amulet clutched tightly in my hand. "It's Grandpa," I said, my voice trembling. "Or rather, something he disturbed. There's a curse. It started when they opened Tamerlane's tomb, and now it's coming for us." She stared at me, wide-eyed, but before she could respond, the lights flickered. The room grew colder, the air thick with the smell of rot. The shadows around us deepened, stretching across the walls like creeping tendrils. And then it appeared. The same figure that had haunted me for weeks, tall, looming, its hollow eyes fixed on us. But this time it wasn't just here for me. It was here for both of us. My sister gasped, stumbling backward as the shadow inched closer. Its presence was suffocating, its dark form pulsating with an unnatural energy. I could feel the air around us shift, thick with malice and ancient power. The amulet in my hand began to hum, vibrating softly as the shadow approached. Without thinking, I raised it again, but this time something was different. The shadow didn't recoil. Instead, it stopped, hesitating, almost as if it was waiting for something. I looked down at the amulet, the strange symbols glowing faintly in the dim light. And that's when it hit me. The curse wasn't unstoppable. The amulet wasn't just a weapon, it was a key to ending this once and for all. I think we can stop it," I said, my voice shaking. "The amulet, it's not just for protection. It's a way to undo the curse." My sister looked at me, hope flickering in her eyes. "How?" I wasn't sure, but something deep inside told me we were close, closer than we'd ever been. "Grandpa's notes," I muttered. "There was something about the tomb, the seals. We have to return the amulet. It was taken from Tamerlane's tomb. If we return it, maybe we can seal the curse again." It sounded insane, but it was the only chance we had. The shadow moved closer, but it wasn't attacking. It was waiting, watching. It knew what I was about to do, and for the first time, I felt like I had a choice. A real choice. "We have to go to the tomb," I said, grabbing my sister's hand. "It's the only way." Together we ran, the shadow following us but keeping its distance, almost as if it was guiding us. It knew that the amulet belonged in the tomb, and I realized then that it wasn't here to destroy us. It was here to end the curse. All it needed was for us to take it back where it belonged. It took us hours, but we made it to the old excavation site where the tomb of Tamerlane lay hidden beneath the earth. The entrance had long since been sealed, but with the shadow at our backs, the way seemed to open itself. The earth shifted, the stones rolled away, and the path down into the ancient tomb was clear once more. With the amulet in hand, we descended into the dark, cold air of the tomb swirling around us. At the center of the chamber was the sarcophagus, massive, looming, its surface etched with the same symbols as the amulet. I stepped forward, my sister close behind me, and placed the amulet on the sarcophagus. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the air around us began to crackle with energy, the symbols on the stone glowing bright as the amulet fused into place. The shadow, now towering over us, let out a deep, rumbling sound, almost like a sigh of relief. The coldness that had followed us for so long began to dissipate, and the darkness in the tomb seemed to lift. And then, just like that, the shadow was gone. I turned to my sister, both of us shaking, but the weight that had been pressing down on us for so long had lifted. The curse, whatever dark force had been unleashed, was finally sealed away. We left the tomb in silence, the air warm again, the terror that had once gripped us now a distant memory. As we drove home, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, my sister looked at me, a small smile on her face. "It's over, isn't it?" I nodded, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "Yeah, it's over." And for the first time in weeks, I knew she was right. The curse was broken. The nightmare was finally behind us. We had survived.